Several years ago, I was browsing through the correspondence of the third Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol. And I was surprised to see that one of his constant correspondents, one of the most frequent of his correspondence, is an old man called Lipa Shkolnik. And then I found out that Lipa Shkolnik wasn't just a simple old man writing to a prime minister, but he was Levi Eshkol's brother. And this man wasn't living in Israel, he wasn't living even in the States, but he was, from all places, living in Moscow. Part of Levi Eshkol's family who stayed in Russia and then lived in the Soviet Union through the whole time, from the imperial times to the Soviet years when Levi Eshkol was prime minister. And in fact, this connection of Levi Eshkol with his brother and his family was part of a much broader phenomenon when Western and Israeli Jews could reconnect with their Soviet relatives after the long years of Stalinism and the World War II and the Holocaust, when connections between the Soviet Union and the West and Palestine were severed and people didn't really contact between themselves. Then in the mid-50s, when with the Khrushchev's rise to power, the Soviet Union allowed its citizens having relatives abroad to maintain some kinds of connections, to write and receive letters, to receive even packages. And at the later stage, the Soviets even allowed Jews from the West and from Israel to visit their relatives in the Soviet Union. And this actually opens the topic that I wanted to talk about. And this is the Israeli tourism to the Soviet Union during this period. It was a rather short window of time between the late 50s and the late 60s when Israeli tourists, disregarding of their institutional background, their political views, just as private tourists, Israeli tourists could come to the Soviet Union, could buy a visa, buy a ticket, and come as private tourists to the Soviet Union. In my research, I regard the reports, information, papers, even secret police papers on these visits as a source on the history of Soviet Jewry, and also as a source on the history of the Israeli reception and Israeli interrelation with the Soviet Union as a symbol and also as a social reality. Thanks to the opening of private tourism to the Soviet Union, we have several thousands of cases of Israeli Jews visiting the Soviet Union, coming to central cities such as Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, and other places, meeting their relatives, meeting other Jews, meeting non-Jews, and then coming back to Israel and writing and speaking about it. So we have not only the visitors themselves, but we have a large corpus of materials describing these visits, memoirs, newspaper reports, and other materials that can be examined. And these materials are really quite interesting and important because they suggest a grassroots view on the Soviet Jewry and the Soviet Jewish experience. I can tell that we do not know much on the Soviet Jewish history. We know much about the Soviet oppression of the Jews. We know much about Soviet anti-Semitism. We know about the Soviet Jewish movement, Soviet Jewish national movements. But what we don't really know well is the history of the ordinary Soviet Jews. We don't know much about the significant majority of Soviet Jews who just maintained their ordinary lives, who were working, who were coming back to their homes, creating a family, and living their life in the Soviet reality. What we mostly know, we know about the unique cases of activists. We know about the few Soviet Jews who in these years were ardent communists. But again, what we don't know is the history of the ordinary Soviet Jews. And the visits of the Israeli tourists provide us with a bulk of materials depicting exactly that. People were visiting their relatives who were living a normal, usual life. And that creates, for me, for the research, a large amount of material that allows to discuss, to analyze the regular, usual life of Soviet Jews, and furthermore, to see how Soviet Jews were discussing the possibility of living to Israel. How did they depict Israel? How do they see the lives of their relatives who lived in Israel and maybe other people in the West? So to make things short, it provides an important and new grassroots perspective on the Soviet Jewish experience. Let me give some example about it. First of all, let's come back to Levi Eshkol and his family. It's quite interesting that Eshkol's relatives in Moscow weren't afraid to maintain open correspondence with him. Not only they wrote to him, but some members of his family actually visited Israel and came back to the Soviet Union and kept maintaining their usual Soviet Jewish lives, and they didn't choose to immigrate to Israel. Maybe they did consider immigration, but they didn't choose it. And in fact, it's quite difficult to depict and quite difficult to understand why a Soviet Jew would prefer to stay in the Soviet Union while he can immigrate to Israel, not as a simple immigrant, but as a part of the family of the prime minister. It's kind of, we can say it's easier to immigrate when you have good connections. We can't answer this question easily. Exactly before, we don't really depict, we don't really know enough what was the real life experience. When we open traveling accounts to the Soviet Union, we actually can find descriptions and explanations precisely about these dimensions of Soviet life. When we read a traveling account of Israeli to the Soviet Union, we would expect that Soviet Jews speak about Israel with interest, express positive attitude towards Israel, maybe even speak about their hidden, more or less hidden interest in immigration to Israel. But quite surprisingly, or maybe not very surprisingly, but quite interestingly, we can see that in many cases, Soviet Jews are interested in Israel, are interested and happy to meet their relatives. But in the same time, they not speak about Israel as a destination of immigration, not with longing, but they speak of Israel as another place on their map. One of the interesting examples of such attitude to Israel we can find in a traveling story written by a kibbutznik who came to the Soviet Union in the early 50s and met his relatives in Leningrad. He was a translator and a quite important literary figure in the literary world in Israel. And when this man discussed his life in Israel with his relatives in Leningrad, he was surprised to find out that his relatives in Leningrad treat him as a provincial who came to visit his relatives in a larger city, in a larger center. They asked him about his work as an agricultural worker in the kibbutz. They asked different questions about Israel. And one of the most interesting parts, from my point of view, in their conversation was the discussion of the Israeli radio translations to the Soviet Union. They openly admitted that they were listening to Soviet radio, but the most significant question about these radio programs in Russian from Israel to the Soviet Jews was not the content and not their importance to the Soviet Jewish identity, but the simple question of the Russian language. They asked their relative in Israel, why can't the Israelis make the Israeli radio translation in Russian good enough? Why the Russian language transmitted from Jerusalem is so bad? And again, it's a good example of a view of someone discussing Israel, not in the eyes of a longing Jew waiting to come back from the exile to return to Zion, but it's a logic of someone living in a central city, having his own cultural capital, and judging the world, including Israel, through these eyes of, we can say simply elitist eyes. And these kinds of encounters, these kinds of conversations show how Soviet Jews understood their own place in the world, not just as an oppressed minority, not just as members of the diaspora longing to come back, to return to Israel or to live to the West, but people living in their own environment and having significant amounts of cultural capital. In a sense, we can say that it changes the usual Zionist imagination regarding the location of the center and the periphery in the Jewish world. Usually, we are used to looking at Israel as the center of Jewish life. And in many cases, it works that way, that Jews around the world look at Israel and as a cultural, as a religious, national center. But here we see something different. We not only see interest in Israel, but we also see that Israel and Jerusalem and the radio coming from Jerusalem is actually peripheral in the sense of culture, in the sense of ability to speak good Russian, etc., etc., etc. I'm not trying to say that the Soviet regime was not oppressive. I'm not trying to say that the Soviet Jewish life was wonderful. What I am trying to say that there is much in the Soviet Jewish experience that we don't know enough about. And the discussion of these encounters of Israeli tourists with the Soviet Jews suggests an interesting and innovative view on the Soviet Jewish experience. Another thing I wanted to mention is actually the way that the Israeli visitors looked at the Soviet Union and why and how they described different dimensions of their experience there. It looks like the Israeli visitors weren't really ready to find or to see these quite surprising dimensions of Soviet Jewish reality. And I think it reflects something in the Israeli expectation and the Israeli view toward the Soviet Jewry. First of all, many Israeli visitors were actually ex-Russian Jews. They were people who immigrated to Palestine in earlier years and came back as tourists to the Soviet Union after dozens and dozens of years of absence. What they were looking for in the Soviet Union was not actually the contemporary Soviet Jewish experience, but their own past. These people saw the flourishing of this Jewish cultural and political life in the early 10s and 20s. They remembered political parties, cultural activism, and many, many dimensions of the rich Russian Jewish life. When they come back in the late 50s and the 60s, they found almost nothing about it. And the only metaphor, the only way of describing it when they came back to Israel was talking about destruction, oblivion, etc., etc., etc. We can't say they expected to find flourishing Jewish life, but still the difference between the past and the present was quite striking. The discussion of the Israeli tourist encounters with the Soviet Jews is important not only as a way of filling a missing part of the historical puzzle we have. It's important because it reflects some fundamental issues both in the Soviet Jewish identity and in the ways that the West and Israel understood the Soviet Jewish experience. Now, when we have Russian-speaking Jews living in Israel, in the West, and other places around the world, it's very important to look into the full history of the Soviet Jewish experience and in the interrelation of the Soviet Jews with its Western and Israeli counterparts.